Welcome to Israel Explained, where we help you understand Israel, Israel's neighbors, and provide you with context to understand the Middle East. My name's Avery Chenault, and I'm joined by Passages resident scholar Josiah McGee. Today we're discussing the U.S.-Israel relationship and our shared values. Israel and the United States have had a relationship since 1948. At times, some of our strategic interests have not aligned, which has made the relationship strained. But it's important to have a relationship founded on shared values when it comes to friendship between countries. So today we're discussing what those shared values are and how it influences the relationship between Israel and the United States. So Josiah, when we're talking about the relationship between Israel and the United States, why are shared values important? How does this influence strategic alliances and friendship between the countries?
Yeah, well, I think you started us off by already putting your finger on some of the tension here. What happens when your strategic interests are not necessarily aligned?
Yeah.
Are you still friends or are you not?
Yeah.
And what sort of holds the relationship together in that situation? So that's a key part of why I think they're important.
Mm-hmm.
It is important to acknowledge that there is a lively debate, of course, about whether shared values actually do matter or not in terms of geopolitical relationships. Some would argue that international relations is really just a giant game of power politics,
Mm-hmm.
and all that matters is maximizing your self-interest. I would argue that oftentimes it does define international relations, but it's not necessarily what should define international relations.
Yeah.
It's just kind of human nature that things do generally reach that stage where people are primarily concerned about their own self-preservation or their own self-interest. There is something to be said, though, for the idea that there are additional values beyond that in an ideal world, even if that's not always true, in an ideal world would also shape the relationship and help to define that relationship. At times, your values do have to sort of be flexible or come second to just basic self-preservation in international politics. But on the other hand, I think it is also true that they are not always separable. That's also a very important caveat, I think, to this idea that international relations are primarily just giant power games. Those power games are not always separable from values. There are, in some cases, an attempt to create power, not just for the sake of power itself, but for the advancement of certain values and ideologies. So you also have to think through how those are going to play into the equation. Sometimes there are moments of tremendous moral clarity when we are reminded that our values matter too, not just our strategic interests.
Absolutely.
An experience, for example, like 9/11 in the United States. That's a case in which it's not just our power that is at stake or our self-preservation that's at stake, but it's also a direct attack on our values, our way of life, the way that we see the world, our worldview. And those moments of moral clarity do help us to sometimes understand that relationship between international realism or conflicts that are based upon strategic interests and those which are also based around value sets. And relationships that can, on the inverse, positive relationships that can be based upon not just strategic interests, but also our value sets. October 7 in Israel was an event very much like 9/11 in the United States. And in that, it reminds Israel of what it's fighting for.
Absolutely.
Not just a self-preservation, but a certain value set that it does not share with its enemy in Hamas. And I think when it comes to the U.S.-Israel relationship, recent events helps us understand that we're fighting not just to survive, both the United States and Israel, but we are fighting for some of the values that we share and that we represent, and the values that are under attack. These values, in many cases, are the reasons why Israel's under attack.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I appreciated what you said about how these really traumatic experiences like 9/11 or October 7th really reveal what kind of values a country has. And I think specifically in the case of Israel, before October 7th happened, it was a time of great division within Israeli society. But after October 7th, there was a lot of unity and within Israeli society, but in
Yeah.
the international realm as well, it's kind of like when you go through a hard time, it shows who your friends are in a way. And that's kind of what happened in international politics as well. So it's definitely interesting to see how that plays out on both a strategic alliance level, but also just more like people came from all over the world to volunteer and different things like that. So it's interesting how those values definitely shape society. So we've talked about these shared values. I want to get into what these shared values actually are. So can
Mhm.
you give us some examples of the values that the United States and Israel both share?
There are several. I think the ones that people typically are drawn to or attracted to are things like pluralism
Mm-hmm.
or democracy or the value of human life,
Mm-hmm.
for example. And we can talk about each of these in turn. I think maybe let's just start with pluralism
Yeah.
and focus there for a moment. So there are a lot of different ways in which Israel represents a sense of pluralism that is very impressive, especially given the context in which it lives. Its place in the world, in the Middle East, a
Mhm.
region of the world that is not very pluralistic,
Yes,
generally
absolutely.
speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And by that, I mean, if there is diversity in terms of people who live in different parts of the Middle East, there is usually conflict between those groups
Absolutely.
that represent that diversity. There's a lot of sectarian conflict
Mm-hmm.
in the Middle East. Israel is somewhat unique in that respect, especially for the neighborhood. It is a country that is about 80% Jewish,
Mm-hmm.
but also 20% Arab. And within that Arab community, you have obviously a majority are Muslim, but about 2% of Israelis are Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So you do have some diversity, both ethnically and religiously, in Israel that you have similar diversity around the region, but not that coexist as well as it does inside
Absolutely.
Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something unique and particularly important about that.
Yes.
There are also a number of even smaller minority communities in Israel. So you have the Arameans, for example, groups that some passages groups have met with in the
Yes.
past. You also have communities like the Druze, which are another subset minority community, relatively small but
Mhm.
distinct. You have, even within the Jewish community in Israel, a
Yeah.
lot of diversity
Mhm.
because you have sort of the ingathering of Jewish exiles from
Mhm.
around the world who are coming from different parts of the world. And that means that you have some from Spain, you have some from North Africa, you have some from Asia, you have some from the Middle East, you have some from Europe. A lot of people assume that Israel is a country where everyone who lives there is someone who used to live in Europe, but that's just not true.
Mhm.
I mean, the population of Israel, even within the Jewish population of Israel, is incredibly diverse
Oh yeah.
in terms of the parts of the world that they've come from,
Absolutely.
the experiences that they've brought with them.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, given all these different groups like the United States, there are a lot of conversations about social equality. It's not always perfect, and there's a lot of debate about how to make it as equal or equitable as
Mm-hmm.
possible, ongoing discussion. But the fact that you can have that many people living there
Mm-hmm.
and finding a way to coexist is remarkable,
Really, yes.
especially given the Middle East. And it is important to note that despite some of the debates that are ongoing, what allows that to continue, that discussion about equality and how to coexist, is a stable legal foundation that provides them a safe environment in which they can have those conversations. Because, again, elsewhere in the Middle East, you would be having a lot of sectarian conflict, not healthy debate about these issues.
Mm-hmm.
But in Israel, you have things like legal and political rights to vote, access different public services, run for office, things that provide you again this safety net in order to which you can have some of those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's also very religiously diverse.
Mm-hmm.
We've mentioned this just briefly. There are, of course, Jews and Christians and Muslims, but you don't just allow them all to live there. Israel also has access to worship at holy sites for various groups.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty unique, again, that you can actually have all of these opportunities in place for different groups to worship in places that are meaningful
Mm-hmm.
to them. Sometimes that's painful. It
Yeah.
means limiting rights of the majority, the Jewish population, to worship in certain places like the Tomb of the Patriarchs in Hebron or the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, in order to preserve rights of the minority to also worship in these places. That is the mark of a very pluralistic society that's committed to the idea that coexistence is important for you to be able to extend these rights to everyone. And again, this extends beyond just Jews and Muslims. You have groups like the Druze, you have groups like the Baha'i. Israel is also home to, a Christian minority that's not generally welcome in the region, or often has to suffer under some pretty severe restrictions. In Egypt, for example, it's very difficult to get permission to build a new church or to repair an old one. In Gaza, Hamas has tolerated some Christians, but it's also executed others, some very famous cases of this. And across the region, persecution of Christians is a very serious problem. So the fact that it's not inside Israel, again, it's unique. The founding purpose of the United States was really to advance the idea that all men are created equal.
Yeah.
And we share a lot of that sense of that worldview with Israel.
Yeah. I think that the pluralism and attempts at coexistence in Israel, even though it's not always just wonderful and easy, and there's some very challenging aspects of it, that is one of, when I first went to Israel, that was something that stood out in my mind so much. I remember my first time in Israel walking down the Via Dolorosa, which is a very important site in Christianity, the path that Jesus walked when he was crucified. And then we were walking down the Via Dolorosa with our Jewish tour guide as the Muslim call to prayer was playing in the streets. And it's like only in Israel, like things, just little situations like that happen all the time. That shows you how much they've had to fight for this pluralism, which is just really unique to see in person.
We take it for granted a lot.
Really, yes, we really do.
It's easy to point fingers and complain about various issues. And it's not to say that Israel doesn't have issues, because of course, like any society, there are tensions. But it's very easy to take for granted how truly remarkable any healthy coexistence in that part of the world actually is.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So something I've heard a lot of people say is that the reason the United States is an ally with Israel is because we share democratic values. So would you say that democratic values are the same thing as pluralism, or do you think that those are separate things?
Kind of. I mean, pluralism is basically the recognition that different groups have the right to express their diversity and to coexist, to live alongside each other and to be accepted. Democracy is related, but I think there is a few more principles as it relates to sort of the political process that I would include as well. And we'll lay out a few examples for you. So, for example, elections and accountability. Part of what democracy means is that there should be some sort of representative government. Not just so that your views can be heard and considered by your leaders, but also so that there can be accountability if you feel like they're not listening to you.
Absolutely.
And Israel has regular elections. It has a parliament. It has a term limit for a given parliament. It is not exactly like our Congress because it is a parliamentary system, but it is a legislative system that includes some form of representation. Because it is parliamentary in nature, it's proportional representation rather than direct. So that means that you don't vote for someone who represents a district. You vote for a party, and then the party gets the number of votes that corresponds to the proportion, or the party gets the number of seats, I should say, that corresponds to the proportion of the vote that they won. So if you won 20% of the votes, you get 20% of the seats in the parliament, as opposed to winning specific seats assigned to a given district. So it's a little bit different, but again, the principle of representation remains. The idea being that you have to choose your leaders by voting for them, and that you can get rid of them if you feel like they're not doing a good job. Because it's a parliamentary system, it means that elections can also be called early. So there's a term limit, at which point you have to call a new election. But you can also call an election early if you want to, unlike in the U.S.
Yeah.
Which means that there's sometimes a little bit more chaos and they have more frequent elections than we do. But again, despite these differences, the basic principles really are essentially the same, that these elections and these term limits create a representative system of government that does its best to hold leaders accountable or provide the people opportunities to hold leaders accountable. So that's the first thing that's generally important in a democracy, is that you have some sort of political process along those lines. You also need in a democracy to have strong rule of law. By that I mean, a democracy requires that everyone respects laws which are passed and that they apply to everyone. So if any subset of society thinks that the laws don't apply to them, whether that is a specific people group or whether that is the elected officials or the very wealthy or whatever, then a democracy is going to be weakened. It's not going to function the way a democracy should if people are above or outside the law. And that's important. So Israel does have a very robust court system to help ensure that there is a strong rule of law. The Supreme Court hears cases and petitions all the time that can come from not just someone who is very, very powerful, but from an ordinary citizen or even a non-citizen. So a Palestinian, for example, can bring a case to Israel's Supreme Court, even though they're not a citizen of the state of Israel, if he thinks he needs to do so in order to seek justice, which is, again, pretty remarkable, actually, that there is that degree of legal accountability in the state of Israel. The courts and law enforcement are trusted not to play favorites. If you want examples of this, it's very controversial, and some people would argue that it is, politically motivated, which in the United States, of course, we don't know anything about controversy about politically motivated law enforcement. But in Israel, the Prime Minister Netanyahu has been on trial for a long time now. And I say this at the time of our recording, he's still currently testifying at his trial. And that is significant, that law enforcement is not avoiding the opportunity to attempt to prosecute even a prime minister. Former prime ministers have also been not just investigated or prosecuted, but even convicted and sent to prison. So that is the hallmark of a very robust legal system, that even the most powerful in the country are held accountable. And can be held accountable by the judicial system.
Absolutely.
The only comments I'll add before we close this is that at times the strength of the judicial system is actually somewhat controversial, and not just because there's accusations of politically motivated investigations or whatever, but also because the precise balance of power between the judiciary branch of the court system and the Knesset is somewhat up for debate. So there's a case to be made on both sides that the judiciary is maybe a little bit too strong and tends to sort of, it's been accused of, I should say, making laws essentially where it should be interpreting them or things like that. On the flip side, the parliamentary branch has been accused of trying to exert too much control and weakening the independence of the judiciary. So it's a bit of a controversy, but I would say the reason why this can confirm our trust in Israel's democratic values rather than leading us to question them is because of the way that the process is played out, the way that the controversy is played out. It's played out in public, not behind closed doors. It has proven that Israel and Israel's public firmly believes in exercising rights like the right to free speech and freedom of the press. The freedom of the press is not kind to the Israeli government. The Israeli press is often not kind to the Israeli government, but that's fine because in a democratic society, you have freedom of press and protest and freedom of speech. And the fact that all of these issues about what it means to be a healthy democracy in the Middle East are debated so publicly and not behind closed doors is further proof that it is a society that holds a lot of democratic values.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk a little bit now about the value of life. So I would say that the value of life is something that has been very ingrained in American society. And I would say that Israel holds some similar values as well. So could you elaborate a little bit on this value of life and some examples of this in Israel?
Yeah, so I think it's easiest to explain this by just comparing and contrasting with Israel's enemies.
Yeah.
Because this issue comes up quite
Mhm.
frequently when thinking about Israel's place in the Middle East among groups of terror organizations or countries that want to destroy it. And just thinking about, okay, how do they think about life versus how does Israel think about life?
Yes.
And which one is closer to how the United States, or let's say Christians, should think about life?
Yeah.
Because we're speaking primarily to a Christian audience. And if we compare the two, I think you have to start with what happened on October 7th.
Mhm.
On October 7th, Hamas committed extreme atrocities. It didn't just kill people. It killed people of all different types: men, women, children, elderly, even babies.
Mhm.
And beyond that, it also not only took away their lives, but also took away their dignity in many ways
Yes.
by torturing them, by committing various atrocities, mutilating even their bodies, acts of sexual assault. I mean, the list goes on and on. It was absolutely horrifying what happened. And they did this in an attempt to not only take away their lives, but to destroy their identity, their dignity, and then they gloat about it afterwards.
Yeah.
To gloat and to boast and to take pride in all of these things suggests that there's a very low value of human life.
Yes.
And if you watch our video on Hamas, I think you'll learn more about why that is the case. And it really comes down to Hamas just having thoroughly dehumanized their perspective of Israelis and the Jewish people. In the war sense, if you were to sort of contrast how Israel has handled the war sense compared with the way that Hamas handled October 7, Israel has, of course, acknowledged civilian casualties. They do happen in war. They're unfortunately unavoidable, although tragic, and each one is something that should hopefully be prevented if possible. But Israel also speaks about these casualties differently. You have cases where individual soldiers perhaps have boasted about destroying something Palestinian or whatever. Generally speaking, there are consequences for that.
Yes.
In Hamas, there would not be consequences. Israel, as a general rule, does not gloat. It acknowledges that the loss of life is evil and seeks to make the conversation more about responsibility. There's a healthy debate about to what degree are they responsible for Palestinian civilians. There's not a conversation about boasting about how many Palestinian civilians have died or trying to make plans to kill as many as possible. It's a very different paradigm that Israel's operating or conducting the war in than the one that Hamas engaged during October 7. It also works hard, frankly, to avoid civilian casualties. We have another video on this that viewers can also watch.
Yes.
And I think it's important to compare and contrast the two different approaches where Hamas is seeking to maximize not just its enemies' casualties, but its enemies' civilian casualties and conduct atrocities in order to thoroughly strip them of their dignity.
Yes.
And Israel's trying to have a conversation about how do we do this responsibly? How do we conduct a war that needs to happen, but do so responsibly and not boast about the number of civilians that die in the process?
Yeah.
You also have a secondary issue, which is the degree to which Hamas and Israel care about their respective communities.
Yes.
And I'm talking about not just how they treat or think about their enemies, but how they think about their own people.
Yes.
So Hamas, we'll start there, cares very little for the well-being of even Palestinians. It deflects responsibility to Israel or to others, saying things like the welfare of Palestinian civilians is not its concern. It is the concern of Israel. That's a really shocking statement for a leader to make, that we don't think the responsibility for the well-being of our own people is our responsibility, but someone else's. You would be hard-pressed to find people who would ordinarily accept a statement like that from a leader, but somehow Hamas manages to get away with it. It also openly boasts about its intention to repeat October 7. And it doesn't matter the cost of Palestinian lives. They throw around numbers like thousands, millions of Palestinian lives shall be sacrificed for the cause, for Palestine or whatever it may be. it's very trivial the way that Hamas thinks about the loss of not just Israeli lives, but even Palestinian lives. It just treats them in a very cavalier fashion. It doesn't matter how many it takes, how many have to die for us to accomplish what we have set out to accomplish as a terror organization. And it speaks about them as expendable, as Palestinian lives as a necessary sacrifice. It intentionally uses those Palestinians as human shields, by hiding among them, whether that's in homes or underneath their homes in tunnels, or that's in hospitals or schools. Again, our video on how Israel has to think about civilians in war has some really good information about this. But there's a lot of examples of how Hamas is willingly and intentionally, if need be, sacrificing them for their own purposes. And even beyond that, I mean, the list just goes on and on. It also extorts Palestinians and manipulates them with humanitarian aid that it controls. There are reports of Hamas price gouging, essentially taking or stealing humanitarian aid, or receiving humanitarian aid directly and then selling it back to Palestinians, but at a marked up price, which, given the accusations against Israel in the context of the October 7 war about just how severe the economic conditions in the Gaza Strip are, it's absurd that Hamas would think that it could get away with price gouging or extorting the Palestinians in exchange for the humanitarian aid that they need. But this is what an organization does when it doesn't really care about its own people and the lives of its own people. It is essentially profiting from the death of Palestinians rather than viewing it as a tragedy.
Absolutely. Now,
again, to flip this and contrast with Israel a little bit, I think in contrast, it's very easy to see that Israel does care about the well-being of its own people. And there are a number of reasons why that is the case, I think. It's deeply traumatized by the loss of life on October 7 and after. Hamas is not. Hamas speaks about the loss of Palestinians as a casual affair, as a necessary sacrifice. The degree to which Israeli society has been deeply gripped in mourning ever since October 7, not just for the lives lost, but also for the hostages.
Yes.
It's extreme. It's something that you would not see in Hamas, but is proof that there is a greater value for life in Israel than in a terror organization. You also see Israelis desperately trying to hold their leaders to account. The IDF, at the time we were recording this, recently published internal investigations investigating themselves for the failures that led to October 7. And most Israelis desperately want the government to also undergo a similar investigation to hold their leaders accountable.
Yes.
This is something that would not happen in an organization like Hamas, that leaders would be held accountable for, or that anyone would demand that they be held accountable for a serious loss of life or a tragedy.
Yeah.
It's also unfortunately true that the Israeli public knows the hostage deals which have been made, in which they continue, again, at the time we're recording this, they continue to advocate for, they probably will do great harm in the future.
Yes.
There will be a loss of public safety in the future because you have to let terrorists go free in order to get the hostages back, and yet they're willing to do it.
Yes.
That is a extreme decision made that really you could only make if you value each individual hostage's life above all else.
Yes.
And that is, again, proof that there's just a remarkably high value that the Israeli public places on every individual life, that they know every individual life is worth it, and they're willing to make a sacrifice for it. Whereas if the Israeli public are ready to sacrifice for the hostages, Hamas is ready to sacrifice their own people for the leader's benefit.
Yeah.
It's the exact opposite, really.
Yeah. That's a great example about the recent hostage release, because it's been, in a way, a very painful thing having to release hundreds of terrorists that have committed horrible atrocities in exchange for one or two innocent civilians or the bodies of children that were murdered in captivity, but it really shows how much Israeli society values having innocent people home where they belong, or for innocent people that have been murdered, having them buried in their homeland is very, very essential. And I was thinking earlier, you were talking about Israel not gloating in their victories, how they try to make sure that's not really something that they're prioritizing, to rejoice over victories and things like that. And it reminded me of this quote I heard from Golda Meir, who was one of the early prime ministers of Israel. And she says this: "We do not rejoice in victories. We rejoice when a new kind of cotton is grown and when strawberries bloom in Israel." And it just kind of made me think about this value of life and how for Israel, they don't want to fight wars, but unfortunately they have to protect the value of life and to protect their safety. So kind of as we're wrapping up this conversation, I wanted to ask you, in Israel, how does the value of life outweigh some other concerns within Israeli society? I know we talked a little bit about the hostage deal, which I think is a great example. Or even if there are aspects of societies in the Middle East that are not performing this way, how should the value of life outweigh other things?
Well, we've given some examples of how in Israel the value of life does sort of outweigh other concerns. Like, for example, are we going to face a security crisis in the future if we let these terrorists go free in exchange for the hostages? When it comes down to why, that's a very difficult question that I think societies have to grapple with.
Yeah.
To what degree is it worth it? Is life actually important? And without some sort of strong moral framework, that's a very difficult question to answer. I think for Christians, I can speak only for Christians in terms of our moral framework. But for us, I think the reason why I would argue that we do need to place a very high priority on life, and we should align ourselves with countries like Israel who do the same, is because that we have a strong moral basis from which to make that argument. It's based in the scripture that we hold to be true, that we believe every person is created in the image of God, that they bear the image of God who created them, and every human has a life that matters because of that image. You know, God is very clear, speaking in Genesis, saying not just that we each bear this image and we are meant to go forth and bear the image, but also that anyone that takes a human life is not just murdering a person, but is committing a direct attack upon himself because it destroys his image.
Yes.
You know, the first few chapters of Genesis, God's making this very, very clear.
Yes.
It's a big deal to him to take a human life. And if you read the rest of Scripture, then of course you're going to understand that there is a complex moral framework which does allow for the taking of life in specific instances in which God allows or even calls for it. But it's not something to be taken lightly or to be done without extremely important and due cause. Like we said at the beginning of this conversation, sometimes I think it takes a tragedy to remind us what is truly important and to provide some of that clarity in that, I mean, let's face it, war, for example, is an ugly reality.
Yes.
It's born out of evil, but sometimes it is impossible to avoid. Israel didn't choose to fight a war against Hamas. It was attacked on October 7. It was literally invaded. So it is a necessary evil that a war be carried out against Hamas. As Christians, we should be prepared to do what is, of course, necessary to confront evil and to push it back. We shouldn't lose sight of our moral compass in the process. And one of the most persistent forms of evil that is in the world today is that which seeks to destroy life. And it is embodied in organizations like Hamas or other terror organizations. So one of the things that we have to do as Christians is think responsibly about what does it look like to stand alongside countries like Israel, which share a similar commitment to life, and work out the complexities of how to stand for it and stand against evil organizations that seek to take it without losing your moral compass in the process, and remembering the reason why we fight is to
Yeah.
protect those values and the image of God in other people.
Yeah. Well, Josiah, this has been a very interesting conversation. I know I've learned a lot. To our audience, I hope you learned a lot as well. And thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this conversation. If you are looking for more resources, be sure to check out the description for more videos that may be helpful in your learning. And if you have any questions about anything that we discussed today, be sure to leave us a comment below and we'd be happy to answer your question. And if you're looking for more content related to Israel and the Middle East, be sure to check us out on Instagram. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.